Proposition 10 expands local government's authority to enact rent control on residential property. Initiative statute. Plain language: allow rent control in California on a broader scale. The background. As we discussed in Prop 1, rent is expensive in California. Californians typically pay 50% more for housing than renters in other states. In some parts of the state, it's double the national average. It's supply and demand. There isn't a large enough supply of housing in places that people would like to live. The demand is growing. The prices are rising. Several cities, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose, have laws that limit how much landlords can increase rents for housing from one year to the next. These laws often are called rent control. About 1/5 of Californians live in cities with rent control. Local rent boards administer rent control, and these boards are funded through fees paid by landlords. Courts have ruled that rent control laws must allow landlords to receive a, quote, fair rate of return, end quote. That means that landlords must be allowed to increase rents enough to receive some profit each year. However, state law, known as the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, or just Costa-Hawkins, limits local rent control laws. Costa-Hawkins creates three main limitations. First, rent control cannot apply to any single-family homes. Second, rent control can never apply to any newly built housing completed on or after February 1st, 1995. Third, rent control laws cannot tell landlords how much they can charge a new renter when first moving in. Now let's talk about taxes briefly. Three taxes are the largest sources of tax revenue for the state and local governments in California. The state collects a personal income tax on income, including rent received by landlords earned within the state. Local governments levy property taxes on property owners based on the value of their property, and the state and local governments collect sales taxes on the retail sale of goods. Long story short, housing in California is expensive. The authors of Prop 10 want to create new laws that would make it possible for the government to put caps on what landlords can charge for rent in California. What does it do? Prop 10 repeals the limits on local rent control laws in Costa-Hawkins. Under this measure, cities and counties would regulate rents for any housing. They could also limit how much a landlord may increase rents when a new renter moves in. The measure itself does not make any changes to local rent control laws. With few exceptions, cities and counties would have to take separate actions to change their local laws. Prop 10 requires that rent control allows landlords a fair rate of return. This puts the results of past court rulings into state law. Fiscal impact. If communities respond to this measure by expanding their rent control laws, it could lead to several economic effects. The most likely effects are: to avoid rent regulation, some landlords would sell their rental housing to new owners who would live there. The value of rental housing could decline because potential landlords would not want to pay as much for these properties anymore. Some renters would spend less on rent, and some landlords would receive less rental income. Some renters would move less often. These effects would depend on how many communities pass new laws, how many properties are covered, and how much rents are limited. Voters in some communities have proposed expanding rent control if this measure passes. If many localities enacted strong rent regulation, other economic effects, such as impacts on housing construction, could occur. Prop 10 would also impact state and local revenues. It is expected that this measure would reduce the value of rental property, given that it would lower the expected profits from these properties. It would also lower rents for renters. As a result, there would likely be less property taxes paid by landlords, more sales taxes paid by renters who would be expected to spend their extra rent on taxable goods. There would be an uncertain impact on the income tax revenues received from landlords because they would be expected to receive less profits, but at the same time they would pay less for their rental properties due to their decreased value. The legislative analyst anticipates that government revenue will ultimately go down if Prop 10 passes. Also, each community can decide if they do or do not want to apply rent control measures. If few communities pass rent control measures, revenue loss would be minor. If many communities do so, there could be hundreds of millions of dollars lost in revenue annually. From Yes on Prop 10. Voting yes on Prop 10 will free our local communities to decide what rent control protections are needed, if any, to tackle the housing crisis. Prop 10 protects tenants. Too many families spend over half their income on housing. That's simply unacceptable. Living paycheck to paycheck means it's difficult for these families to make ends meet, much less save for an emergency. Seniors on fixed incomes have less to spend on food and medicine. Many of the people who should be the foundation of our local communities, the teachers, nurses, and firefighters, are forced to move far away from the communities they serve because corporate landlords are doubling or even tripling their rent. With so many families struggling, many are driven to move away from California altogether, leaving jobs, relatives, and schools behind. Even worse, many are forced into homelessness and living on the streets. With every 5% rent increase, 2,000 more people are forced out of their homes, a devastating blow to them and an even worse homeless problem for California to cope with. Voting yes on Prop 10 will allow cities that need it to pass laws limiting rent increases. Prop 10 does not mandate rent control. It does not force any community to adopt any rent control measures that would not be a good fit for their own housing situation. It does not force any one-size-fits-all solution for any city. Instead, Prop 10 simply allows communities that are struggling with skyrocketing housing costs to put an annual limit on how much rents can be raised. Communities are free to bring more fairness to housing, ensuring that tenants have protections against huge rent increases, while ensuring that landlords receive a fair rate of return with reasonable yearly increases. Voters have heard a lot of confusing arguments about Prop 10. Don't believe the attacks. Wealthy real estate interests, corporate landlords, Wall Street investors, big Wall Street corporations like the Donald Trump-linked Blackstone have spent millions of dollars to fight this measure because they are terrified this will cut into their huge profits they make from the thousands of foreclosed homes they buy. They don't care that California families are being crushed by high rent. It's time to take a stand for affordable housing and against greedy Wall Street billionaires and corporate landlords by voting yes on Prop 10. Prop 10 is a limited measure that answers one question: who decides housing policy, local communities or Sacramento special interest and powerful real estate investors? It doesn't establish any new housing policies, it just lets local communities, which are closer to the people, decide what works best for them. It's time we had the power to tackle the problems of homelessness and skyrocketing rents within our own communities. All of these people support Prop 10. From No on Prop 10. The sponsors of Prop 10 want you to believe it will magically solve our housing crisis, but Prop 10 is badly flawed and will make our housing crisis worse. Prop 10 is bad for current and future homeowners. It allows regulation of single-family homes, controlling how much homeowners can charge for rent in their own home, or even just a room. Prop 10 might even lead to bureaucrats charging homeowners a fee for taking their home off the rental market. Stephen White, president of the California Association of Realtors, says, Prop 10 could hurt homeowners by authorizing a new government bureaucracy that can tell homeowners what they can and cannot do within their own private residence. It could make homes worse. It could make homes more expensive for future buyers and hurt families trying to purchase their first home. Prop 10 is bad for renters. Alice Huffman, president of the California State Conference NAACP, says, Tens of thousands of renters, including seniors and others on fixed incomes, could be forced out of their apartments and communities under Prop 10, which allows wealthy corporate landlords to turn apartments and condos into short-lived vacation rentals. It will increase the cost of renting and make it even harder to find affordable housing. Prop 10 puts bureaucrats in charge of housing. They can add fees on housing, ultimately increasing rents and making homes and apartments more expensive. It puts taxpayers at risk for millions in legal costs. Prop 10 requires taxpayers to pay the legal fees for tenants or voters who challenge this law. It adds tens of millions in new costs to local governments and costs millions more in lost revenues, which will result in less money for schools and emergency services, reduced home construction, and a loss of thousands of well-paid construction jobs. Prop 10 will drive up the cost of existing housing. New government fees and regulations will give homeowners a huge financial incentive to convert rental properties into more profitable uses like short-term vacation rentals, increasing the cost of existing housing and making it even harder for renters to find affordable housing in the future. These people hate Prop 10. Because this is the second proposition along these lines, you've already heard my perspective, and so I'm not going to start from scratch again. You can revisit my opinion on Prop 1 for that. I actually think that the yes on Prop 10 camp did a better job at presenting their case. The difficulty with a no position is that it requires the voter to cast the hardest kind of vote, voting against something that you want or like because it simply is not right. I believe that rent control is simply not right. That's why it's illegal in many cases. People buy or create rental properties and are entitled to do with their own property as they wish. This is America, not Cuba, not North Korea, not the Soviet Union. Nobody has a constitutional right to live wherever they want at a price they would like to pay. Places grow and change, and that's part of life. Now, I'm not a wealthy guy. I personally have been pushed out of 3 different homes due to skyrocketing rents, and so I moved. It was annoying and I didn't want to do it, but I did it, and I don't believe that I have a right to force the landlords to keep the rent where I want it just because that works for me. I don't believe in that, and I don't think it's constitutional. Would I enjoy knowing that my landlords couldn't raise my rent beyond what I would like to pay? Yes, but that doesn't make it good or right. The people writing the no position understood that most people don't seem to care about what's constitutional if it is not in their own personal interest. And as a result, they base their argument on the most self-motivated viewpoints on this measure. But think about this. Rent is the paycheck of the landlord. What if the government made a law putting a limit on how much you could charge for your services at work? It's not right. Often people raise the issue of, how will we have maids and gardeners and teachers and whatever? That's not a concern. The laws of economics will correct themselves. If a hotel can't get enough maids, they'll raise the salary of maids, and eventually it'll work out. If you need a gardener, you'll pay what it takes to get someone out to your property. That's the economy. That's what happens. Maybe you want to live somewhere in the heart of Malibu or Monterey. Maybe you live there now and are struggling with the rent. Rather than trying to leverage the arm of government to force people to house you at a price you want to pay, you need to accept that you can't afford to live there anymore. That's what I did. It sucked, but that's life. Someday I will live in my favorite places again, but it's my responsibility to make that happen, not the government's. Moreover, rent control is not without its unintended consequences. I'm not going to spend time here going through everything, but I invite you to research the downsides of rent control. But basically, when you remove the incentive to provide a product or service, landlords improvise, and it's never in the favor of the renters. Plus, the force of the market pushes people looking for homes into other solutions, and that drives up costs elsewhere. This is California. I expect this proposition to pass, but I vote on personal principle and not based on personal comfort. If you have a legitimate philosophical reason for promoting rent control, the Daryl Johnson Show always supports your freedom to vote your conscience. That's the point of this, and that's why I present both angles. If you vote yes on Prop 10, you are voting to legalize rent control statewide in California. If you vote no on Prop 10, you are voting to leave things the way they are. The Daryl Johnson Show says no on Prop 10.